There are events in some people's lives that cannot be explained, and the following two stories are no exception. The mysterious blue glow. On the night of December the 31st, 1987, a woman named Mrs. Benson was awakened by the restless behaviour of a pet cat and dog. Assuming the animals wanted to go outside, she let them into the backyard, believing that this was the cause of their agitation. However, once outdoors, the pets became extremely frightened and frantic to come back inside. Perplexed by their panic, Mrs. Benson grabbed a robe and went to investigate the situation firsthand. To her shock, she observed her trembling dog crouched next to a nebulous, icy blue-coloured shape surrounded by a foggy grey-orange mist. Bizarrely, large electrical sparks or mini lightning bolts appeared to be emitting from the base of the hazy form and penetrating the soil below. Alarmed by the scene, Mrs. Benson attempted to retrieve a petrified dog. The moment she touched the animal, an intensely strange sensation overtook her body. She began experiencing a splitting headache and severe jaw pain. Pins and needles prickled across her skin as numbness set in. Concurrently, an ominous psychological shift transpired in her mind. Mrs. Benson felt an overwhelming sense that her very life essence was being drained from her body. Despite her best efforts, she found herself unable to move or call out to her husband for help. As the ominous fog maintained its position, Mrs. Benson grew increasingly convinced that she was slipping away into death. Meanwhile, her husband had awakened to investigate the odd noises. By the time he found his wife outside, she was barely conscious. In her debilitated state, Mrs. Benson was just barely aware of a sharp jab of pain at the base of her neck, as if a needle was being forced into the area. Simultaneously, the bizarre blue mist disappeared as quickly as it had manifested earlier that night. In the aftermath, all that remained was an acrid sulphur-like smell hanging in the air. Both the dog and cat sat motionless in almost trance-like states, staring blankly ahead, even after the fog had dissipated. Mrs. Benson seemed to have fallen into a similar stupor. It took several minutes to revive her from the apparent hypnotic trance. She was left bedridden for days after, suffering from intense migraine headaches and nausea. Additionally, Mrs. Benson's sweater was found to have several melted holes burned into the fabric. Forensic tests indicated that a powerful electrical discharge of some kind had struck her body, with enough heat to singe the sweater she was wearing. Now over a decade later, the Bensons still have no rational explanation for the events which transpired on that bizarre winter night. The only clues left behind were scorched clothing, frightened animals, and an unshakable sense of dread from a close encounter with the unknown. The vanishing hitchhiker, or variations such as the ghostly hitchhiker, disappearing hitchhiker, phantom hitchhiker, is where people travelling by vehicle meet with or are accompanied by a hitchhiker who subsequently vanishes without explanation, often from a moving vehicle. There is a place on the coast of New South Wales, Australia, where many people have been advised to beware of picking up a woman that is hitchhiking. Jenny Dixon Beach has a famous urban legend where what looks to be a normal-looking woman suddenly appears. Her arms are outstretched and she appears to be begging for assistance. People claim that as they were driving along Wilfred Barrett Drive, heading towards Norrville on the central coast of New South Wales, they claim to have picked up a hitchhiking woman. The area is a narrow piece of land surrounded by the trees of the Warrabulong National Park, which itself is surrounded by two large bodies of water, the Tasman Sea and Tagara Lake. All of this area is known to be haunted. Witnesses claim to have seen a young woman standing at the side of the road, and she appears to be asking for a lift. The driver then pulls over and asks the young woman whether she needs a lift, and when she finds out that you're both going in the same direction, she jumps into the car. However, she does not get into the front seat, but chooses to sit in the back. Around the world, there are similar stories where people who claim to have picked up these types of unusual entities all state that the person does not talk at all and quite often prefers to point. But in this particular case, words were spoken, but very little was said, which was the case with this particular hitchhiker. The conversation was very short, and her voice appeared to trail off. In a classic example of a phantom hitchhiker, one second they were talking and asking questions, and the driver suddenly realizes that they're talking to themselves. This is a common scenario all around the world. As the driver took a quick glance into their rearview mirror, they found that the young woman they'd just picked up had vanished from their moving car, and they'd not heard the car door open or close. The driver said that they arrived in the town of Norrville in a state of shock and initially felt that they were going crazy. When they asked around to find any plausible explanation as to what had just happened, they found that they were not the first to experience such an ordeal, and that it happens all the time. Apparently, the local police in the town of Toukley have received many reports of such occurrences, and the locals knew all about it as well. This was not the first time that a driver had experienced such an ordeal, as this series of events had been happening for more than 40 years. The locals will tell the driver that they had just met the local ghost, whose story was a very tragic one. The hiking woman of Wilfrid Barrett Drive seems to be more than just a story, and has become a part of local lore. To find out more about the phantom hitchhiker, you have to go way back to the 1970s, where a young woman was making her way along Wilfrid Barrett Drive. In the 1970s, that particular stretch of road headed to Norrville and would have been long and dark and probably frightening for a lone hiker. On this particular occasion, the young woman in the story was hitchhiking along the road when a car came up from behind and stopped to offer her a lift. The car was full of young men, but the young woman nevertheless jumped into the vehicle. Unfortunately, they did not take her to a destination, but instead drove down to the local beach against her wishes. The young woman was then assaulted and beaten and left for dead in the surrounding scrubland. After a period of time, some locals had found the young woman badly beaten, but still alive, but unfortunately passed away a few days later. But before she actually passed, the police were able to communicate with the young woman, who said she wanted to seek retribution for what had been done to her. The police were unable to get a clear description of the young men, but they did have their suspicions. They picked up and questioned 5 young men, but without absolute proof, they were released. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, DNA testing was not available. Even though the 5 young men went free, it seems that the young woman did receive justice. Over the following year, there was a series of strange accidents and suicides where the young men involved in the assault lost their lives in various ways. 3 were killed in car accidents, 1 hanged themselves, and another died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Within a year, all 5 of the young men were dead. Maybe they had suffered from extreme guilt and were now tortured souls. Apparently, the young men had complained of seeing and hearing things leading up to their demise. For 40 years, people had reported seeing a young girl at the side of the road, and on many occasions, she has nearly caused accidents that people had to swerve off the road to avoid her. Even the police are said to have witnessed the apparition. Apparently, the young woman's name was Jenny Dixon, and the area she was found is now called Jenny Dixon Beach, and locals using the beach at the end of Wilfrid Barrett Drive reported seeing the ghost of a woman. They said she appears out of nowhere and stands in the scrubland with her hands outstretched and looks to be appealing for help. She will stand back towards the scrub, having suddenly appeared out of nowhere. She holds her hands out to whoever she sees as if she's appealing for help. Many who know her story are aware of her plight, but are unable to do anything as they know she is a spirit, and her appeals are either ignored or they are too terrified to approach her. Historically, the area just south of Jenny Dixon Beach is called Nora Head, which is a piece of coastline that juts out into the Tasman Sea. It was once notorious for shipwrecks that would regularly occur for seamen and passengers who were unaware of the dangerous coastline. Vicious storms would blow their ships onto the rocks, or the ship would become beached. In the 35-year period leading up to 1871, at least 7 ships ran aground. Into 1903, a lighthouse was erected. Due to the many shipwrecks, other ghosts have been sighted, so the spirit of Jenny Dixon is not alone in the haunting of that region.